Well, we're off to a good start in the CapSim simulation. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over that. Separate video, I'll probably go over the spreadsheet where I determine the winner, so you won't hear that, hopefully, in this particular video. And then in a separate video also, I'll go over next week's assignment. So, let's go take a look, see how things turned out. You'll find, and let's go, I'll log into a team here because I want it to look kind of like you guys, so no particular reason, I'll pick Team Chester this time. Okay, and so when you're here, okay, what I typically do, and again, you guys may find other ways or that you want to do this, or maybe other routes, but I would typically go to reports, industry reports, and then this Capstone Courier. Okay, you can also access the Capstone Courier through Excel. You know, if you're making your decisions that way, okay, you can open up your Excel and access the Capstone Courier that way. Either way is fine. It's kind of, again, a personal preference. So I'm going to go back and just go into the Capstone Courier the way I normally would. It's very similar in that I come to reports and then I hit the Capstone Courier. It gives you a choice, I believe, that you can either view it in HTML or download it in a PDF version. And I'm going to go ahead, typically I would just open it when I'm looking at it in the HTML, but I'm going to go ahead and do it in a PDF. I think that'll make it a little bit larger for you guys when you're viewing this on the screen, on your screens. So maybe some of the numbers that I would look at and talk about would show up, although it does take quite a while to download that particular PDF file. It says it's still working. I guess it's time for me to have a drink of coffee while I'm waiting for it to download. I might be able to go brew a pot of coffee. Ah, there we go. Alrighty. See if I can get rid of that and make it even bigger. So when we start, you know, at the top of the Capstone Courier, it just gives us, of course, the round and the folks, you know, that are competing. Then I come down to selected financial statistics, and I kind of, you know, they've got this set up pretty well. I kind of like the way they have it in the order that they have it. For me, it's fairly intuitive. It's kind of what I like to do when I scroll down in the order. It's fine. Okay, and I always like to stop here, you know, and I got to take a look, and of course ultimately we're worried about profits. That's that by the end of the game, so you know, it won't be the big item, and maybe it's not even at this point in time. That might differ a little bit for those of you that played a similar game with Kevin's class. Profits aren't, for me as an investor, I'm not going to say I don't care about profits. I care an awful lot about profits, but I care how those profits relate to other factors, and I think you'll find I'll talk about that quite a bit as the game goes on. But in any event, you know, generally one of the first things I'll look at is the sales. I just kind of like to see how we did. Okay, so I can kind of quickly glance along this line and say, hey, you know, this is pretty good. Nobody, pretty good in the sense that nobody really went way up and nobody went way down. You know, oftentimes I'll see in the first round one or two teams that kind of implode right away, make a grievous error or something, but I don't see that here. You know, a range from 107 million up to 126 million. Yeah, $19 million range, not that much really. You know, and as the game wears on, that's going to be relatively small. Okay. EBIT, glance at, that's fine. But then profits, we look at that and we see that Andrews had the highest profits, followed by Erie. Baldwin, a little less. Baldwin had the highest sales, interestingly, but not the highest profits. And there are reasons why. Okay, and in fact, one of your assignment questions is going to relate to that. Okay, and you should be able to, and what I've asked in the question is just looking at this particular statement, why would you say Team Andrews had higher profits than Team Baldwin, even though Baldwin had higher sales? Okay. I normally don't spend a lot of time looking at this. It kind of gives us market share. You'll see it's pretty well balanced. Market share can be a big deal, but not necessarily. We might have a team that ends up getting a very high market share, but they're doing that by lowering their prices and lowering their margins, and not necessarily making a lot of money. Okay, and versus a team that has higher margins, less market share, a lot of things come into play. So there's no one factor that necessarily makes one team better than the other, and I think we'll see that when I go over my scorecard. I come to the stock market summary. Now, you all started at the same price. Okay, we see that we had a nice change. Team Andrews, even though it had the biggest profit, its change in its stock price was fourth best. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Okay. I also see everybody started with 2 million shares, and 4 teams actually issued or sold some shares. I'll end up talking maybe a lot about that as the game goes on. We'll see. One of your questions relates to this. Okay. One of your questions relates. You'll see Digby sold a lot of stock. 335,000 shares of stock. I think it was at its opening price, so about $35, $34 a share, something like that. Okay, to raise some money, apparently. It gave Team Digby the biggest market capitalization. Okay, that's a good question. I didn't ask that one. Okay, its stock price. Its close is $3, $2.50 less than Team Erie, yet its market cap is bigger. Okay, it's because of that. Okay, that'll be a question that I might ask in the future. We do see that Team Andrews paid a dividend. We do see the earnings per share. I find that for this game is one of the main factors. Okay, if I am a investor, okay, where we all started out equally with the number of shares and we did all start out equally at price, this to me is a key thing. In the real world, I can't compare earnings per share of Microsoft and Apple. That's no pun intended, but that's an apples to oranges comparison. Okay. Because each company has different shares outstanding, different numbers of shares outstanding, different price. Google and Apple, Google and Microsoft, no comparison. Okay, except I want to compare Microsoft's earnings per shares from this year compared to last year. I want to know if those are growing and why they're growing and those types of things. In this game, however, I can compare earnings per share only because we started out with the same number of shares and at the same price and whatnot. Okay, Andrews did pay a dividend. Okay, not necessarily a huge impact in the first round. We might see bigger impact as we go along. It should have had a bit of a positive impact on its stock price, although again we see that its stock price actually went up quite a bit less, even though it had the highest profit. Good question would be why. I didn't ask that yet in the assignment. I might change my mind on that. Okay. On the bond market summary, I like to glance at. Gives me an idea if a team or teams have borrowed money. Okay, in the long term, this doesn't have anything to do with short term. Okay, and what I'll see here is that Andrews paid off some debt. Okay, and Digby incurred some debt. Kind of interesting. Maybe two different tactics proceeding there. It looks to me like the other team's debt, at least long-term debt, okay, short-term debt would be a different story and not reflected on here, but it looks like long-term debt, the other 4 teams didn't do anything. Okay, I get down here to the financial summary, and I spend a decent amount of time on the financial summary. Okay, cash flow, this tells me an awful lot. Okay, Of course, I look at the income, which I saw from up above. Depreciation right now, okay, I don't see a huge difference. A range of about 7.6 million up to a range of about 8.5 million. Okay, well, and the reason for that is that we're just pretty early. Everybody started the same, right? But why then, if everybody started the same, is depreciation a little bit higher? Say with Chester, Ferris, okay, some of these teams. The reason would be investments in, okay, Interestingly, well, we'll come down and take a look. So they've made some investments in some depreciable assets. Okay, is what has happened. They've made some investments in some depreciable assets. Okay. In this case, what would that be? It would probably either be automation or plant improvements. Okay, which is capacity. I'm sorry, automation and plant improvements are automation and capacity are both plant improvements. Sorry, I misspoke there a little bit. Got an interesting thing going on here because Erie made the most plant improvements, but its depreciation did not increase, and there's a reason for that. Okay, there's a reason for that that's interesting. We might see that or talk about that a little bit later. Usually the accounts payable, accounts receivable, they're more a reflection of the sales, okay, and what we got going on. And its net effect on cash flow is usually not a big deal, usually, okay. There can be some exceptions to that, and that kind of depends on how people make decisions about how they handle their accounts payable and accounts receivable. Inventory one's a good one to look at. It's a good one to glance at. We see in Ferris's case, inventory had a negative effect on cash flow in a pretty big way, $9 million. Andrews even more. Okay, what's that mean? Well, when I'm looking at the cash flow, and we'll see it later, there's other reports that give us more specific, it means that Andrews ended up having a decent amount of inventory left over. Okay, again, accounts receivable, not, again, not a huge range and not a huge amount of money, and so we see net from operations. Always look at this. I always want to know what the competitors are doing and to what degree they are doing it. So again, we see a high of 14.4 million that Erie spent. Didn't affect their depreciation. That's just interesting. I think I know why. And Chester, Baldwin, Ferris, each of those three spent a decent amount of money. Digby, not so much. Andrews, about half, what these other teams did. Okay, dividends we saw, right? And so that had a negative effect on cash flow. Remember, we're just looking at the cash flow statement here. Sale of common stock. Remember, we said that a few teams sold some common stock. Chester, not so much. Digby, a big way. Okay, and also cash from long-term debt. So Digby also incurred a decent amount of long-term debt. Digby didn't want to run short of money. Andrews, on the other hand, paid off some debt, interestingly. Okay, and then we had Big Al. Okay, Big Al stepped in and had to, because Andrews didn't manage its money as effectively as they should have. Why? The answer is all in this column. Okay, all in this column right here will tell you why Andrews didn't manage their money as effectively as they could have. There's reasons for that, and it's all reflected in that column. That's one of your questions for the assignment, so I'm not going to get into that. Chester, almost perfect. They ended up with a little emergency loan, not a big deal. Okay, so we come down, and then we would assume Andrews and Chester would have zero cash. Look at Erie. I mean, they're just right on the edge of needing an emergency loan, whereas Digby has $41 million nearly in cash. So what's good cash management? Well, cash is king, and all those other things, all those other sayings are wonderful. I would tell you at this point in the game, Digby spent a lot of money selling common stock. They spent a lot of money borrowing money. Okay, interest, other things. We'll see the interest down below. And so it was expensive for Digby to do those things, to raise $23 million, which had they not raised it would have still had $17 million. Okay, cautious, nothing wrong with that. We see Digby didn't have an emergency loan. Digby's also got a lot of money now going into this next round that they can spend on other improvements. So I'm not saying that it's horrible cash management. It looks unnecessary at this point in time. Could you have put it off? Yeah, but it might give Digby some advantages going forward. Accounts receivable, again, we kind of saw that up above. More reflection of sales. We're down to we're away from the cash flow now, and we're onto the balance sheet. And again, I like to look at this. Okay, accounts receivable. If I see major things there, then I know something's going on. Inventory, just a reflection again of what we saw above, right? We knew that Ferris and Andrews had a decent inventory because it affected their cash negatively, and that's reflected here. Overall, these inventory numbers aren't horrible. Often in the first round, I'll get a team that'll just be completely out of whack when it comes to inventory. Total current assets, add those up, right? Plant and equipment, okay, we saw some teams increase their plant and equipment, right? Okay, with the investments that they made above. Okay, accumulated depreciation, just adding up the depreciation that we had along with this period's depreciation, which we saw above, no big deal. Total fixed assets, I like to glance at this as we go along, because this and total assets, I'm sorry, but these give us an idea of how big a company is, and return on assets kind of becomes important, because the more efficiently and effectively a company can use its assets and turn those over, the better it will do. Okay, but what do I mean by that? If a team, say, had $100 million in total assets and another team had $200 million in total assets, the team with $100 million in total assets could make a lot less money and still be better. For its investors or its shareholders. Okay, and so size isn't always better, I think, is kind of my point there. And as financial managers, financial people, those are some of the things that we need to look at. Okay, size can be great, don't get me wrong. Walmart, Amazon, they sell all kinds of stuff. They have all kinds of size, and they generate a lot of cash, money as a result of those things. Okay, but there are smaller companies that actually make better returns for investors, okay? Simply because the return, they're more efficient with the use of assets, is, I suppose, the best way to put that, okay? Then we get down to debt. Current debt we look at, again, we saw here the emergency loan. It looks like Team Ferris borrowed $15 million in current debt. Okay, yeah, better than getting an emergency loan, right? That made the difference. Had they not borrowed that money, okay, they would have had an emergency loan, but they borrowed $15 million in short-term debt. Roughly the same. Here's the difference. They paid an extra 7.5% penalty. Okay, so a huge penalty that Team Andrews paid that Team Ferris didn't have to pay, even though they ended up borrowing the same amount of money. So, don't be afraid to use current debt to build some a comfort level, cushion up there. Common stock, again, we saw some teams issue common stock, and that creates this equity thing. And like total assets, to me, equity, okay, one of the big things that you get scored on in my score thing is return on equity. Okay, return on equity is net income divided by equity. Okay, there's two ways to improve that then, very simply. You can improve net income, right? That makes the number go higher. Okay, but you can also reduce equity. That makes your return on equity number go higher. Okay, so return on equity is a factor of both, and too often I think we spend all of our time worrying about the net income side of that equation. We don't spend enough time worrying about the equity side of that equation. That said, when equity gets too low, then the risk is incurred. Okay, and risk, if we come and look, I'm gonna scroll up, and I'm sorry I do this maybe a little too often, but I want to scroll up here. Okay, and we got leverage, and it doesn't tell us how they calculate leverage there. I think it does in another spot. But leverage, I believe, is assets divided by equity. Okay, and I'm not sure that that's right. I'll have to go and look at that. But anyhow, if our equity gets too low, okay, then our leverage gets high. Is what that ultimately means. And with high leverage, we have high risk. And you'll see in my score sheet that there can be some penalties for taking on that kind of risk. It may be worth it in some cases. Okay. So income summary. Like to look at this sales. People get bent up over the variable costs. Oftentimes, when we come down here and we're trying to figure out net profit, and we say, "Oh my God, look at that! They had variable costs that were $90 million, so much more than Chester. 15 million more than Chester." Of course, they had sales that were, 20 million more than Chester, 19 million more than Chester. Okay, my point is that the variable costs are only relevant. Relative to the sales number. Okay, a more important number than the actual dollar amount of variable costs is this number here, the contribution margin. Okay, the contribution margin is a huge margin. Okay, now everybody was kind of close here, although we had a low of 26.5, we had a high of 31.7. Okay, huge factor. Okay, that means that Andrews had, if both teams had 100 million in sales, look at that, the teams were just about even in sales, okay, and yet Andrews had a 4% higher contribution margin, so that means that it made nearly $5 million more, okay, before interest and taxes, but $5 million more in EBIT right there. Okay, and actually it was a little more than that. Okay, so it's a huge factor. Okay, is the contribution margin. The actual dollar amount down here is not so relevant. It kind of is here because we're just starting off, but believe me, as we get going along, it's just going to be difficult to make that comparison in terms of variable cost, but the proper comparison to make is up there in the contribution margin. Depreciation we kind of talked about up above. SG&A, so this is your investment in sales, promotions, those types of things. So marketing, a lot of that marketing stuff, and this can be huge as well. And it's another number that comes up here. I'm scroll back up, though we see this in a percentage here. And again, the percentage here, much like the contribution margin, is more important probably than the absolute dollar amount that gets spent below. We'll see teams get big and teams get small, and it's this percent then that will oftentimes make a big difference. And it's the opposite of the contribution margin. Contribution margin you want bigger. SG&A to sales margin you kind of want smaller. And the reason I say kind of is because if you get too small, you're not going to generate sales. Okay. It's a number though that relates to efficiency. Okay, so at 8.5%, okay, and that's based on its sales. Andrews was quite efficient with his SG&A. Okay, Chester was not efficient at all. Right, they spent 2.3% more in marketing and those things, and generated less sales. Okay, let's go down and compare the dollar amounts here. My guess is they spent roughly the same in dollar amounts, but Andrews was more efficient with it. Okay, let's go check the dollar amounts and see. Okay, when I come back down. So SG&A, they spent 10.4. Chester actually spent more, okay, but generated less sales. Okay, less efficient. Why is that? Generally, and this is really a generalization, it may be an overgeneralization, it gets down to the customer buying criteria. Okay, so a couple of factors actually, marketing can have a big impact on sales, don't get me wrong, but customer buying criteria has as big of an impact. So earnings before interest and taxes, our interest, we see, obviously Andrews with their emergency loan had a big interest payment. Digby borrowed some money. Remember, they borrowed long-term money, so they had a higher interest. And Ferris borrowed short-term money, and so they had a much higher interest. The others, about the same. Taxes, you want that to be up. That means your profits are up. Okay, profit sharing. We don't do a lot that really impacts profit sharing. and then our net profit. Okay. As we scroll down, we get to this production analysis, and this one I like to glance at, and this is not unusual for the first round. But what I can glance at here, I see the blue is our capacity, and the yellow or gold is our production. Okay, what I will tell you is that we have just all kinds of excess capacity. Just glancing at this, and why do I mean that? Doesn't it looks like Andrews, produced right up to its capacity? Well, no, they didn't, because this is first shift capacity. Okay, Andrews could have produced twice as much. Would have been a mistake. They'd had even more in inventory, right? Would have been a huge mistake. Okay, or Andrews could have sold its capacity down to here and still had that much in production. Ooh, well, that's an interesting concept. So they could have sold capacity, raised some money, cash. It's not profit. Well, some could be. We get into some accounting and selling things for capital gains or whatnot, so some of that could be. But in any event, they could have had their capacity here and their production way out here. So, for me, as the game goes on, generally speaking, we'll see that the gold lines will get longer. Relatively speaking, the blue line will get smaller. Okay, generally speaking. Some teams are really reluctant to use that second shift because you have to pay them time and a half. Okay, and I want you to think about, is it less expensive to pay time and a half versus making full use of a facility that you have? Okay, remember, you're paying for that facility regardless. You've got interest payments on it, you've got all depreciation, you've got all kinds of expenses that are, lights, fuel, heat, whatever it is, okay, expenses that you have to maintain that facility, okay, and you're only using it for 8 hours a day. So there's 16 hours a day that facility is going to waste. And so you got to weigh those things and think about them. Okay, then as we scroll down, this again, we're in the production analysis, and this is really an important part here. Okay, I end up spending a decent amount of time looking at this. For one, I like to look at the inventory that we have and where inventory was left and where it was not. In the low end, there's actually only one product that had some inventory left in the low end, and it's not really a low end product. Okay, this was a little bit of a quirky thing that happened here, and I'll explain it while we're going through it. Okay, well, what happened is all the low end, the real low end products sold out. You can see they sold out, and so it had to stretch, to get enough product to meet demand. And because there was an overlap here at the start, it was able to take some traditional products and sell those in the low end. It sold enough of Able, okay, that Able actually ended up getting classified as a low end product, even though it's still well positioned in the traditional segment. Okay, but it sold more in the low end than it did in the traditional segment. Able did. Okay, and so that's why it ended up getting classified as a low end product. It's not. Might depend on what Andrews does with that next round, but it'll probably flop back to being a traditional product if it sells more in that area. So really, we sold out of all of the low end products. Okay, and we don't have a lot left over in the traditional, but some. 571,000. Remember, these are in thousands. 400. So we got about 1 million items, 1,000,004 plus 4, so about 1,000,008, something like that. 1,000,008 in inventory there. Okay, low end, really none. It's interesting. High end, some. So I like to go through, look at the inventories and whatnot. Revision dates, we got to check. I'm a little bit concerned about these ones that are out into 18. This one I'm not, because it's a new product, but I'm a little bit concerned about some of these other revisions that are out to 18. And I'll tell you why. What year was this? This year was 17, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. Why am I concerned about that? Well, I'll tell you. I think, if I look at these, your product then actually didn't move this round, okay? And I'll give you an example here. Okay, Adam's revision date was on the 17th, September 17th, and its performance and size coordinates, performance 8.9, size coordinates 11.1, okay? Revision date here, and you would think if they revised this, and I'll bet you they did, I'll bet you they set their performance and size coordinates to be much higher, okay, and much lower on the size, so higher on the performance and lower on the size. But because the revision date was so far out, a year in advance, that didn't take effect this last year. So whatever revision they made won't take effect until next year. And we see one, Team Baker did that, Team Chester did that, and it looks like Team Ferris did that as well, okay, creating a little bit of consternation, okay. You have to be a little bit wary about those revision dates. You do not want to revise products, and your guide tells you this, but I'll kind of repeat it, more than a year out. Okay, what'll happen, so when you get in there, you won't be able to revise this product, okay, because it's already going to revise this coming year, so you won't be able to make changes. Baldwin won't be able to make changes to bid, Chester won't be able to make changes to cedar, and Ferris won't be able to make changes to fist, okay? Okay, other things to look at then. We look at the pricing. I mean, this is an easy chart here to kind of look at the pricing for everything. I might want to know, well, what company had the lowest price for the low end? Yeah, 21. Ooh, look at that. Chester, they sold out, but boy, they got really a high price there. Dell, 21, and sold a lot. Okay. Ebb, $21. Ooh, $20 down here for Ferris, and they sold a bunch. So Ferris kind of took a little bit of a low cost approach there. Okay. That's kind of interesting. Okay. Okay, so just kind of glancing again a little bit at things. Here's over time, if we used any of that. Here's the contribution margin. Remember I said that that's such a huge deal up above. Here's the contribution margin per item. Okay, and I find that this can be kind of important. And everybody did pretty well in the contribution margin to be close to that 30, and I think your guide says that's a good thing to shoot for. I'll tell you that oftentimes toward the end of the game, we'll see some products, some, not all, but we'll see some products in some segments will approach or maybe even exceed 50% on the contribution margin. So I wouldn't set 30 as your goal. Okay, I would set your goal higher than that. And then we see capacity for next round. So Andrews didn't change its capacity. I think this is what everybody started with. So now I can go down and kind of make it, well, they added a little capacity there. They added some oddball capacities here and there. Okay. And we need to talk about that. We'll come back. Ferris didn't change its capacity. Okay. And how about automation? I like to look at automation. I like to see if a company is spending money improving its automation, and you see a few changes in here. Get Chester kind of some oddball changes, but that's fine. Decent change here for Ferris. They went 5 and a 6 on both traditional and the low. Okay, up here we had Andrews changing more in the high and the performance area. So kind of interesting, some of the changes. What I like to look at is I like to start trying to understand what strategy my opponent has. Okay, and so if there's one thing I can encourage you to do, it's when you're analyzing this, analyze your opponent as much or more than you do your own team. Okay, so analyze the heck out of those things. Here's an important thing. Erie, remember up above I was talking about they made the plant improvements. It doesn't look like it started the depreciation. It looks to me the reason for that is that what they've done is introduced a new product. And so they invested some money, but that product's not going to come online, and that's what your guide tells you until this next year. Okay, and that's probably when Erie's depreciation will start. Okay, that should have helped Erie a little bit this year then in terms of their earnings per share and their ROE. Okay, That's interesting. Um, and we'll have to see how a new product does. Where it's going to be placed, we don't know. They did buy some capacity for that, okay, and so that's what the cost was. Okay, cruise on down. Now we get to the segment analysis, okay, and this, I can't stress enough. Look at what goes on in these things. I would say that the gravest error that most teams make as this goes on is not paying attention to this tradition or the customer buying criteria. In this case, we're talking the traditional. Okay, you see how important items are. These don't change the importance. These will change some. The price does. Okay, the ideal position changes. The MTBF doesn't, and the age doesn't. Okay, the ideal age. But these change. Typically as time goes by, they want the price to be less. They want the position to be better. Okay, and so you have to adjust, especially these. And you have to, when you adjust these right here, your ideal position, it should affect the age. Okay, MTBF then. Here's an important thing. It's not that important. Is it worth spending money to keep the MTBF way up towards the top end? That's a good question. It's only 9% of the importance for the customer. Something to think about. Okay, so spend time on this. Always look at what the demand is, and then I like to go up and look at what the inventory. Remember I said there was about 1.8 million left over in inventory, and we got 8.1 million demand this year. Demand's going to go up by 8% next year, so it's going to go up by, what's that, 640,000, so we're going to be about 8.7. Got 1.8 million, so all the teams next year only need to make about 7 million, somewhere around there. That's really back of the napkin math. You might want to be a little more efficient. I certainly would if I were doing it, right? Calculate what the demand is, what the growth is, and what the inventory is, so I know what how much all the teams together need to make. Then I can kind of try to figure out what share of that I want to try to grab, okay, and figure out how I'm going to go about doing that. And that's tactics. Okay, the perceptual map's kind of hard to see here. We'll see a better perceptual map as we go a little bit lower. So I don't spend a lot of time looking at it by the segments. But here, this can be kind of important. And I'll ask some questions in homework that'll have a lot to do with this as we go along. But actual versus potential, and I talk about money being left on the table. Everybody's pretty even here, so there's no money really was left on the table. Everybody sold about what their potential was, but it's interesting that Chester had great potential here in the traditional segment, as did Erie and Ferris, and Digby not so much, half. Okay, and again, watching this might help us sometimes understand what a team's doing for its strategy. Okay, top products, and I like to go through these and kind of try to get an idea, why a product sold well or why it didn't sell well, what types of things might have had an impact. Sometimes it's tough, here we got, Fast with a 21% market share, Cake with a 20% market share. They sold, almost the same, right? Neither one of them stocked out. Okay, Fast probably had a little better coordinates. I don't know. It improved the performance, okay, but its size stayed bigger, so I wouldn't know that that's better. Probably about the same. Price was the same. MTBF was the same. Cake was actually a little closer to the ideal age on December 31st, and Cake or Chester spent more money on promotion and sales. I almost look at that and say Cake should have sold more, and there's not a lot of difference, okay. And Cake certainly has a better December customer survey, so it's going to hit the ground running a little bit better next year. Well, here's what I think happened in this case, and this is really minor again, but the revision date here was a full month ahead of the revision date here, okay? And so really for a lot of the year, Fast was closer to the age than was Cake, okay, until we got to the end of the year. And so again, that's a really small thing in this case. Okay, really small thing. But that's probably what led to just that little difference in the sales. Okay. Sometimes we like to look at some, we look at Baker then that only had 11%. Well, what hurt Baker? One, it ran out of stock. So, but it didn't have really any greater potential than that, and so that's fine. Okay, its still potential was still pretty low. Its revision date was a little later in the year. That might have had an impact. They moved. Okay, Baker moved a lot, right? Now, revision date, yeah, Baker moved quite a bit. Okay, and the fact that that was late in the year could have impacted it a little bit, right? At the end of the year, it's sitting good, and it's got a good customer survey. Okay, MTBF is down a little bit. Okay, and it spent a decent amount there. Okay, its potential still wasn't all that great. Okay, again, I might say that that was because during the better part of the year, its age was quite a bit higher, and then at the end of the year, it's sitting pretty good. Okay, and so going into next year, it should be sitting pretty decent. Okay, price-wise was fine. Kind of interesting. Okay, so again, I like to go through these, really take a look. I won't look at each one. But your customer buying criteria changes with each particular one. Now here we go. Look at this one. Wow. Okay, so Andrews only had this much potential, but this much in actual sales in the low end. What happened? Well, remember up above when we were talking about the low end, and we said that all the low end products actually ran out. Okay, and so they had to fill some of that demand by selling some of the more traditional products, and Andrews is the team that really benefited from that. Baldwin to a little lesser extent. Okay, and you look at Acre was Andrews' main product there, but Able sold almost as much, and Able was its traditional product that just sold a bunch right there in the low end. Okay, because all of these ran out. So it's kind of interesting. You could say, and I'll ask this question later. I mean, they they gained about 11% of market share there. Okay, and they did that primarily with this product, this Able product that they sold for $28. Okay, so 10%. This is back of the napkin. They sold 1 million products at $28 that they might not have otherwise sold had there been more of these actually made and on the market. Okay, so they benefited to the tune of about $28 million if we go back and look at their sales and their profits and those types of things. Okay, a lot of that was because you guys gave it to them. So kind of interesting. Chester had a very low potential here, so Chester really wasn't as did Andrews really. So Chester wasn't really that well positioned. Okay, and why? So they only sold 6%. They sold out, but their potential wasn't too great. Hey, look at that. Their product is out, so it didn't move at all, no big deal, but price. Okay. For a low end product, and their price was still $25 compared to 21, 21, 20, 23, 21. Now these were traditional products, so they were a lot nicer product. That's probably why people bought those instead of Chester's low end product. Age was fine. I'm actually the ideal age here is 7, so that was fine. Didn't spend a lot on marketing either. Okay, and thus a kind of a low potential there. And December customer survey is a 7, so but nobody's really in good shape there. High end, a little bit there. Again, paid a lot of attention to the customer buying criteria. Remember too that each segment's growth is completely different. Look at the high end's growing at 15.2%. Okay. I don't want to spend a ton of time. You guys should though. You guys should spend a lot of time. Chester has a very low potential here. Okay, in the performance, I think it was kind of odd when I looked at this though, because in the size, on the other hand, Chester had a huge potential. So quite a bit difference in understanding why. You guys should take a look at that and see why. Okay, we were looking at that, the performance versus actual. Okay, and this is extremely up above is just a chart, and it gives you a rough idea. Okay, but when we get down here, it's a much more detailed. Okay, remember in the low end, percent of units. So in the low end, the total sales were about 10 million, right? Okay, and we look at the actual market share, remember Able had 9.2 and 11.3, and remember we said that their potential was a lot less than that. And so here's where I could do the math. So really, for their Able product, okay, they had a potential of 0.2%, and they sold 9.2%. So they benefited to the tune of 9% in that marketplace, and their Acre product had a potential of only 9.3% and sold 11.3%. So they benefited to the tune of 2% of the market right here, okay, with that. And so they sold, an extra 900,000 roughly of Able, and they sold an extra 200,000 of Acre. Okay? And later I'll ask you on some of your assignments to do the math, right? And we'll start with just do the math for sales and try to figure those things out, and it'll get more complicated. Here's a little better perceptual maps, a little more visible, I think, or easier to see as to what's going on. This becomes huge again in terms of trying to determine what your competitors are doing for their strategy. You'll see people start to separate, and you'll see products getting out here on the edge and trying to be competitive at the high end, and you'll see products here start to fade towards the back and give you a better idea what strategy is. A little too early to tell at this point in time, right? We see a little separation that's kind of odd down here in the low end. Things are still kind of clumped up here. We do see a couple teams here in the high end that have made a little move out front. And again, we had a couple products that won't show up as having moved because the teams, made that revision date out too far. HR, we don't see HR starts in round 2, however, where you can spend some money on HR. Here's the number that we'll look at when we get to there is that productivity index. You get higher productivity, you get lower labor cost, which can be a big deal. TQM, we don't start until round 4. Okay, then the annual report, and if I keep going down, I get the annual report for every team. You guys will just get your own annual report for your own team. So that's really a rundown of some of the things that I look at when I'm doing the review of the round. Hopefully it gives you guys some ideas of some things to look at. I'll do a little deal like this every week. It'll probably get shorter as time goes by because I won't spend as much time, I won't need to expend as much time really explaining all the details like I did today. So hopefully this helps, and you can expect to get this on a weekly basis. Thanks.